Hello, and welcome back to A Sort of Young Person's Guide to Prog Rock. I am your host, Ian Prize. So, in this episode, we introduce undoubtedly the most popular band prog rock ever spawned, Pink Floyd. And we go back to their origins, not as the wall-smashing, wish-you-were-hearing rock gods they became, but young students in Sgt. Pepper's London. So today, Pink Floyd, Piper at the Gates of Dawn. So today we are joining Pink Floyd, at this point comprised of bassist Roger Waters, drummer Nick Mason, keyboardist Rick Wright, and singer, songwriter, and guitarist Syd Barrett. They have just met in a polytechnic school in London, and as many young kids did in this era, started jamming to the blues. Pink Floyd is thus named after bluesmen Floyd Council and Pink Anderson. They started to make a name for themselves playing space rock, complete with psychedelic light shows in the burgeoning London psychedelic club scene. In the mad enthusiasm for psychedelic rock bands, Pink Floyd were signed and produced 2 hit singles, Arnold Lane and See Emily Play. They were then tasked with recording a full-length LP to be produced by Norman Smith. In the studio, they created unusually arranged versions of Syd Barrett's whimsical English vignettes, as evidenced by its name, Piper at the Gates of Dawn, which is a chapter in The Wind in the Willows. They also included 2 long space jams, Interstellar Overdrive and Astronomy Domine, pointing to Pink Floyd's live club bona fides. This album, Piper at the Gates of Dawn, was a minor hit, setting them up for modest success in the near term. But this album would walk a line between strange and catchy, which would be a blend that Pink Floyd would ride all the way to the stratosphere. So, Pink Floyd, namely Dark Side of the Moon, is why I'm here. I'm assuming it's the reason a good proportion of you are here. It's the natural stepping stone from rock to progressive rock, and if you get deep enough into Pink Floyd, and you followed them all the way from Dark Side of the Moon through to The Wall, the most obvious question is, well, what came before? I've always loved these songs, but preparing for this podcast, especially throwing it into contrast with Sgt. Pepper's, I've only come to realize what a unique talent early Syd Barrett Pink Floyd were. Piper is shrouded in legend because of the loss of Syd, but I've always tried to understand the album on its own terms as a joyful expression of psychedelic whimsy. So to get whimsical with me today, joining me again are Rufus Daw. How are we doing?
Hey, I'm good. Good to be here.
And the Piper at the Gates of Dawn himself, Edley Winks. How you doing, Ed?
Edley Winks as well. Yeah, doing good. Yeah, really happy about doing this one. So it's an album I really love, and a time in history I really love musically. So yeah, I'm pumped for this one.
Fabulous. I guess I'll start with you, Rufus. How did you feel about this era of Pink Floyd? Was it an era you were familiar with?
No. So I think the era of Pink Floyd I'm most familiar with is the Roger Waters side of it.
The classics.
The classics, yeah. And so this was an experience for me, I think I would describe it as. Okay. Because I hadn't really listened to early Pink Floyd, and I'll be upfront, I don't like it at all. I appreciate what they were doing at the time as well. And I think it was certainly at the forefront of music history and the progression of rock. But as a listening experience in the modern day, even with the context and without the context of what they were doing at the time, I don't find it enjoyable. That said, when you start to learn about the history, it does become really, really interesting about the dynamics of the band and what they were trying to achieve as well in quite a lot of adversity at the time. So I think in a lot of ways it's great for that reason, but as a simple piece of music,
not your favorite.
I struggled to gel with it, basically.
Yep, that's perfectly reasonable. So Ed, how much of this era of Pink Floyd did you know about?
So yeah, I'm kind of the anti-Rufus on this one, because this is this is an album I've listened to quite a few times, and it's actually been really nice to come back to, because I think I was quite a lot younger when I'd heard this and I was like first getting into it, and having learned a little bit more about the equipment of the time, because that's always my thing. Like I get obsessed with the fuzzy little dirt boxes that people use, and I'm a gear nerd. So like I like listening to all this stuff from the 60s and like, oh, that's one of those, that's Tone Bender, that's, so hearing, I'm hearing the equipment shaping the music.
Okay.
In a way that I think maybe people wouldn't necessarily agree with me on. Like you talk about anything to do with Syd Barrett, you start talking about mental health, and people start listening to stuff in the lyrics, and it's you're trying to assess whether you're listening to the decline of someone's mind or whatever. But it's like I don't really see it that way. I actually hear a guy who's actually quite lucid. He's talking about very interesting things that he's been reading about that we'll probably get onto as we go through the tracks and stuff. But when it's playful and whimsical, it's like the music comes with that, and it's all quite upbeat, and it's very, very English to my Welsh ears.
Yep.
To my Welsh ears, it's very English, and it's very much in those particular types of songs that are like really upbeat that happens. But in the darker sounds, I don't think they're due to someone having a mental decline. I think it's about the equipment, and I'll talk about that in more detail. But I think for me, what really makes this like a great album is the production, and the production is Norman Hurricane Smith, who did Rubber Soul.
That was the first thing I was going to flag up on this. So Norman Smith was the producer, and he worked as a technician for the Beatles, kind of during the Beatles, big mid-'60s era. And then I believe this was his first or one of his first jobs as a full producer. And he didn't really go on to do much of, I think, this level again. I don't think he had other credits this size again. Kind of like it or not like it. Like it's maybe an acquired taste, maybe he never acquired the taste. There's a lot in there. I can't believe how much sound he packed into these songs. And I think that was one of those because the song structures are very simple. They come from that English nursery rhyme place. Most of them are basically nursery rhymes about gnomes named Grimble Grumble and a cat named Lucifer Sam and stuff like that. And then on top of that, it's like harpsichords and delay effects and wood blocks whizzing left and right all over the place. Until we get to Jug Band Blues, which is the very, very last song we'll talk about. And that's kind of Syd Barrett's swan song with Pink Floyd. Outside of that, you never really get the sense of any real mental health issues within the lyrics, but the absolutely all over the place nature of the songs, their construction, and kind of their overall sound. I don't know. Like, I guess it just has the feeling of a man who's looking beyond this reality, I'll say, to put it nicely.
Yeah.
Well, that chaos wasn't necessarily all Syd as well. So Nick Mason said in an interview that this recording studio had various musical instruments that had been loaned in for musicians that had played there the day before, but had just been left. So what would happen is Pink Floyd would come in, it would be their session, they'd be ready to go, they'd find all these amazing instruments, pick them up and just try and stick them into the record they were working on that day.
I think the other big theme I'd bring up is, in my mind, I always kind of just put like this and Sgt. Pepper's and Days of the Future Past and Disraeli Gears in one big psychedelic blob. Like, oh yeah, that's 1967 British psychedelia. That's over there. I think now, staring it right in the face, we have got Sgt. Pepper's, which we did 2 weeks ago, and Piper at the Gates of Dawn, released, 4 months apart. And one is the Beatles, who are battle-hardened touring veterans who have now come to make some art rock. And one is Pink Floyd, some dudes who just put together a band and just got chucked into the studio. And I can feel that it's the same air they're breathing and the same musical space they're inhabiting, but the professionalism on Sgt. Pepper's and the amateurism, in a good way, on Piper at the Gates of Dawn was really apparent when I looked at them side by side, which I really have never done. And it feels like these are kids just excited to play around in the studio. So I guess, what you say really makes sense.
Yeah, I'm hearing that. Yeah, I feel that. Like I say, people are always going to be quick to talk about, it's the decline of this guy. it's like captured on tape. It's like, I don't think that's true at all. Like you're hearing a band who are like excited, you know, they're on the crest of some kind of wave of something big that's about to happen in their lives. You know, I think they're gelling, like they're really enjoying the process together.
And you were right. I feel like a really big part of this story is they're just young kids who really want to be a part of the scene and are just so psyched to get this record deal, basically. And I can feel that they brought that excitement.
Weirdly, I was listening to an interview with David Gilmour earlier on today, because he was actually quite close with Sid before ever being anything to do with the band. And he talks about meeting Sid before this and saying that he saw, you know, that look, or that not proper look, you know. I mean, described
the 1,000-yard stare.
Well, they described as I can't remember how Roger Waters describes it in one of the songs, but he gives that description, and he said like the other guys just didn't see it because they were with him for so much of the time. And he was saying, like, you know, having been away and then coming back, because Gilmour's band at the time were doing quite well, and so he'd been away, you know, and he came back and he said, like, I saw this change, but the other guys, no, they're not seeing it. So I don't think it's anything that they would have been concerned about whilst making this record.
I think, obviously, the loss of their friend Sid, and I think that's got to have been so horrible to be, you're 20 years old, you're on the cusp of, like, fame and fortune, like what you had as a band all work towards. Because obviously they were, you know, all, like, college buddies together, basically. You know, these are also 20-year-olds in 1967. So one guy just, quote-unquote, can't get it together, and I don't think there would have been a language for what that meant. I think it's just like he just can't get it together, and he's flaking out on shows, and he's not being lucid, and he's being disruptive in the studio, which he would go on to do in the second album, so he's only briefly in the second album. And Roger and David, and at some point Rick, go on to produce Sid's 2 solo albums, and they talk about the frustration at the time in 1968 or 69 or whatever, feeling like, Sid, why can't you just get it together? You've got this musical career that you should be working on. But I don't think there was a understanding of what was happening to Sid, basically.
Yeah. The Joe Rogan podcast had Roger Waters on very recently, and he talked about this period quite a lot, actually.
Yeah.
But I think what came across, despite how deep you go into it, was that, you know, he really loved this guy, and he's still sad now. Because it's like, this was their songwriter. This was the guy, you know, who wrote these songs that got them recognised in the first place. And he had to learn to write songs.
Yep.
And it's just amazing that he went on, or the band went on to be so successful. You know, what's the chances of that?
We'll talk about this in a little bit, but about the amazing, I guess, transition, obviously, to the behemoth that Pink Floyd becomes. And we'll talk about what was left over from this period. But I guess to finish that point, and then we'll get on to the gnomes. You know, obviously, I think it's super traumatic for a bunch of 20-year-olds to lose a good friend. But he's still there. And I think that makes it all the more confusing. But all of this to be said, I actually have been wrestling with this as I've been listening to this album this last time around. And actually, I want to put a pin in all of that and say, you know what? It's a really joyful album. This album is filled to the brim with, like, delightful little parts. And Nick Mason famously will go on to say the next album, Saucerful of Secrets, is his favorite album. And I could totally imagine why. I can see that at this point, everyone is playing something. There's, like, unlimited freedom. And then also, I think this is the rise up. This isn't the, I have to stare in the mirror and figure out what fame means. This is the, like, perfect creative freedom and the long march to fame that must have been just an absolute riot for these guys. So I could imagine that this whole stretch of albums, probably up until Dark Side, would have just been so fun to make and so satisfying career-wise. Because I think that's the other really nice thing about Pink Floyd is they start this as a moderate hit when it comes out, and then they march and march, and every album they do a little bit better, and then they hit mega stardom with Dark Side of the Moon. And then mega, like, legendary stardom at the end with The Wall. And I think that's the most amazing thing is Pink Floyd just starts at a pretty moderate high and then just builds with every album pretty directly towards The Wall. And I guess just for all of you at home, the main transition that happens is obviously Syd Barrett has to leave. And there's lots of different accounts of how this goes, but basically Syd Barrett cannot function in the band anymore. So they bring on David Gilmour, singer and guitarist in the local scene, and friend of Syd Barrett, to kind of cover for Syd Barrett. So he plays the Syd Barrett songs like Syd Barrett, and then ultimately just becomes the new singer and guitarist in the band, and then they go on to become the Pink Floyd that we know and love. So that being said, what elements do you think Pink Floyd just completely jettisoned after this period, and what do you think they maintained?
So Roger himself talks about that whole jaunty Englishness that you hear in the writing of Syd. And yeah, it sounds wacky, but it's really upbeat and it's jolly. One thing I notice about that, if you look at this album as like light and dark, those are the light elements, are all these jolly Englishness. But what I heard was someone who may be cooped up indoors all day, and it's that point where they step outside. Yep. Like he talks about the outdoors and the creatures and the objects that inhabit the countryside, yep, real or imagined, with that positive light. And he uses these jaunty lyrics that you shouldn't be able to land. And he seems to, because he just delivers them quite confidently. They sound like nursery rhymes or whatever. But Roger Waters cannot write that way. He doesn't write that way.
No.
And these sort of darker tones that are present in this album, I feel like they're really shaped not by anyone's mental decline, but by the equipment they're using.
Gotcha.
You said it yourself, like David is his friend, that he's in there to pick up the playing parts that he's not able to do in the studio anymore. He's essentially spent quite a bit of time playing with Syd when they were like teenagers. They played guitar together before there was Pink Floyd. So that's what's taken on. Literally, he's taken that fuzz pedal, that delay unit, So there's like
the guitar rig, basically.
Yeah, like there's a seamless transition of guitar tones, which I'll happily go into detail on, that are like an iconic sound for David going on. Obviously, he's got his own stuff, but one of the big ones is the Bison Echo Rec, and you hear this delay unit like all over Pink Floyd's latest stuff. And it's a really interesting delay unit, and I will go into it. So, like, tape delay, like, you can do so much with tape delay. You could literally get your fingers in there and adjust the speed by putting pressure on it. But the Echo Rec was actually like a metal drum that span with magnets attached to it. So it was kind of fixed. It had, like, buttons you pressed with fixed intervals of time. So yeah, you just had a button that was that speed and a button that was that speed. Yeah, there was wobble to it because it's,
a physical unit.
Yeah, it's a piece of kit from the 60s. But because it's got these fixed intervals, you're going to hear that same musicality every time you use it.
Gotcha. Yeah.
All the spacey stuff you're hearing in this, like Stella Overdrive. What a great name for a track. It's fed by that piece of kit. Or the fuzz pedal he's using a specific fuzz pedal, And you could say that about, psychedelic music in general. Like, it's all about fuzz and what that does to your amplifier. To me, that's the stuff that goes forward after this album. It's the darker elements, the light elements.
The jaunty English songs.
Yeah, the jaunty English songs.
Yeah, there you go.
I actually really like the bass on those ones. Like, the way the bass plays with the organ, actually... I think there's some really good production there. Again, it's quite a subtle use of it. It doesn't overpower anything. That's not anything I'd say is like a signature sound. I just think that's to do with, the production technique on this one. But yeah, there's some nice contrast here. And I think if you had all of the light and all of the dark on two separate albums, they wouldn't be as interesting.
No, and I think that tension really underpins the greatness of this album. So, Rufus, having not really experienced this part of Floyd, is there anything you could hear from this that you heard then later in Floyd? Classic Floyd, I guess.
Yeah, I think the most notable thing is actually the style of song and the content. And I think this plays on Ed's point as well. And obviously, this doesn't include the sort of jaunty, dainty, dancey English rhyming slang songs, as it were. This is quite famous. Hans Keller interview with Syd Barrett and Waters. It's famous because Hans Keller just kind of shits on the entire album and them as musicians. But I think something Syd says is quite poignant on that interview, where he said basically all the tracks are what they are because they realised they don't have to be danceable in order to be popular anymore. And that was very much the thing in the 60s. Dance halls were the primary scene where music was played, and you got popular because you could play music that everyone didn't necessarily have to listen to word for word, but could just dance along to, right?
Yep.
And they realised we don't have to do that anymore. We can start doing really weird shit, and people are still going to love it. And I think they took that mantra to the next level just time and again as the albums progressed.
And we're absolutely going to talk about that. I think that's one of the strongest themes for me, is that Pink Floyd maintain their weirdness.
Yeah, this whole period, like I think about Fleetwood Mac, with Peter Green. It's like a really similar story, isn't it? Like they were kind of bigger than the Beatles at that point because they played music that you could dance to. These sort of like upbeat blues covers. And they had the same thing, like their frontman had a breakdown and disappears, and then someone else has to step in and become the new songwriter. And not only did they survive, they became
Fleetwood Mac
rock behemoths. It's like the same story. Yep. It's really interesting.
And I guess this is probably just because there's actually, like, relative to all of the bands that start, there's a tiny, tiny fraction that we ever hear about. I was like, it's funny, I'm surprised that you don't hear the story all the time of an unstable frontman who, when the limelight comes, because the limelight must just be absolutely crushing. You're absolutely right. Peter Green is another one of these tales.
And it's another one where, like, it's the kind of the blames put on the drugs when the reality is probably, these guys...
Yeah, this is just when these things come on.
As a creative genius, is often someone who spends a lot of time indoors creating, and, they're like thrust into the most ridiculous limelight, and that takes a toll. And so... yeah, it's easy to go, they were on LSD and blah, blah, blah. But, I think the reality is, and the Beatles say the same thing, they weren't looked after. People didn't know how to deal with that level of fame. It never happened before.
And they're all 20.
Yeah, they're just kids. And, you look at some of the situations the Beatles were in that we've talked about before, it's dangerous. It's lucky these guys survived with their lives, yeah.
And I think classic Pink Floyd will use it again, famously for Shine On You Crazy Diamond, Wish You Were Here. And I don't think it's even that cynical. I think it's that people have friends and whatever that they miss. It is that simple. And I think it's the Roger could dig up the feeling of missing a good friend who is now lost to him, make some great songs about it, and the world wants to hear it. These are powerful songs about quite a touching situation.
I think maybe, and somewhat controversially, Pink Floyd wouldn't be as successful if it hadn't have happened this way. I definitely think that a lot of their success is from the inspiration that Barrett left. He sort of set the tone, but then also him leaving and the way in which he left allowed them to, like you say, cool on that.
Yeah.
And I think they're so influential. And in a way, maybe he's still part of the band in a weird way for all this time, but never there in person.
To play the what if game, I think if Syd hadn't had mental health issues, I think that they would have gone into the Canterbury scene. And the Canterbury scene was basically the really chilled countryside version of Prague. And so I often think, I think if Syd had stayed in Pink Floyd and they had stayed as a thing, I think he'd have remained the primary songwriter. And I won't talk about him specifically, but let's say a writer like him who wrote very psychedelic-y songs, I actually don't think was going to transition to the 70s particularly well. Because I think you needed David Gilmour's really, really crystalline blues skills, and then Roger Waters' look at society, look at yourself lyrics. I think you needed both of those to become megastars. I think if Pink Floyd had stayed in the nursery rhyme, they could have maybe gotten as big as Peter Gabriel Genesis. And they'd become like a huge cult band. But I think it required them to pass the torch to Roger and Dave ultimately to become 70s powerhouses.
In another way as well, like the music that they're making in '67 with this album, when you watch them play it live, it's amazing. It's unbelievable. Like the effort that goes into the production for the live show is almost equal to that of the effort that's gone into the song itself. And I think this is partly my problem with the album, is I don't know if it translates so well just to listened media, right? Like I don't know if as a song on its own does it enough justice. And I think the later songs of Pink Floyd don't have that problem because they don't necessarily have this reliance on the visual show to give this sense of wonder or joyfulness or sadness, where it's clear when they're doing their live shows in '67 that they really needed that to
pump it to the next level.
To pump it to the next level, to convey what they wanted to convey with the song and the meaning of that song.
And I was going to say, I think the apprenticeship Pink Floyd will do between now and then, and I feel this very strongly, is they do, I think, somewhere between 2 and 4, I don't know how many actually got finished, but movie soundtracks. And I think that makes them slow down and consider how you start, middle, and end an album. And Pink Floyd's albums are masterpieces in kind of emotional construction. And they're going to learn that over the next few albums. But this album right now, and then Saucerful of Secrets, and then More, so their first 3 albums, have this really all over the place energy. And I have a lot of affection for this album as basically a tiny little box filled with little jewels, where I was like, oh, look, like there's Lucifer Sam, there's Matilda Mother, like, oh, what a delightful jewel. And then I can put it back in the box. But I never feel like I'm on a journey. And I feel like I could listen to this album on shuffle. I don't even really know what the track order is. If not for the fact that it's written in front of me, I couldn't have told you the track order. Which is funny because then we get to Dark Side of the Moon, and it's this like divinely inspired architecture within the music almost, where it's like, oh yeah, like that has to be the beginning and that has to be the middle, and this is side 2 and blah, 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 blah. I think this one's just like, ooh, yet another delightful little song. So I find them to be tiny little jewels of delightfulness. But ultimately, this era just feels like a bunch of singles. And I think we'll start right at the beginning with their very first single, Arnold Lane. So 1967, a young Pink Floyd gets signed, and they get to go into the studio with Norman Smith and record Arnold Lane. And Arnold Lane was, I believe, a local character. I don't know if his name actually was Arnold Lane, but he was a local character who used to steal women's underwear off the clothesline. And then Syd Barrett made a song about him. I guess beyond the kind of English penchant for a quote-unquote character, I don't have a lot to say about the subject matter of the song, but what I will say is this sounds really cheaply made. Like, this song sounds so cheaply recorded. And I don't really know this, but in 1960s, for these young bands, did they trial out, like, you get 3 minutes, go into a studio, see what you got, but we're not going to invest money in it, basically. Sgt. Pepper's sounds like really wild, but it sounds so professional and sounds actually pretty fresh.
Yeah, this is very fuzzy, crunchy, right?
Yeah, these are very crunchy, and it just has the, I guess, just the complete all over the place sound of Pink Floyd.
Personally, I think this album, The Piper, is probably the only thing that you've got with Syd on it that's polished.
No, I'd say this is true. And I think this one, obviously, they're coming pretty much hot off the clubs. And they go from this to then make See Emily Play, which I think is their first really big hit. So See Emily Play is based on a psychedelic trip Syd Barrett had. That's about it. That's the background to the story. And then he just wrote a story about this Emily person. Again, like, it's just, I absolutely love the construction of the song. It has all of the fun, like, Beatles chord shifting. It's got a wacky harpsichord solo. And I could see why you'd hear these first 2 singles from Pink Floyd and be like, okay, this is a band I'm interested in. It's 1967. I'm looking for some crazy psychedelia. This is a band to watch.
Yeah. Your first response to this was like, yeah, this is a weird band to listen to with modern ears. It really is. Like, we keep talking about this sort of nursery rhyme style songwriting, and what would be the fate of the band had Sid remained
at the helm.
And it's like, I've got kind of two thoughts on that. One is maybe he wouldn't carry on writing that way. We won't. There's no way to know. And I don't think it's actually quite as nursery rhymey as we keep saying it is. Like he does reference like some books that he's clearly into that we can talk about. The other band that I can think of that write that way at this time is the Kinks.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Again, they're just talking about things like that are English, only English people see. Objects that you only get in the country, like turns of phrases you don't hear elsewhere. And how well did they do in America?
Yeah, I mean they are known, but again,
they're not Pink Floyd.
They're not 1973 Dark Side.
Exactly, and I think it's interesting, and like the guy's clearly intelligent, and he's put stuff from really interesting books into his work. He's even like quite a genius painter, like there's a lot to this guy. He's not just writing silly nursery rhymes. Like it's deep stuff, but it's not for a wide audience, is it? You think of music that really resonates with people is really day-to-day stuff, isn't it?
Well, and I was going to say, I feel like maybe that's the thing, is I think they would have been kneecapped if they had continued with this type of music. I think like what takes Pink Floyd to superstardom later is the universality of what they talk about. And it can't be the English countryside, as in that can make you a cult band, and that can make you a well-respected cult band, but you become transatlantic and then global superstars when you start singing about the pressures of modern life or alienation or whatever, which is what Pink Floyd would go on to do.
Yeah. But, say, like the song like The Gnome, that actually sounds like classic prog right there.
Yeah.
But, like, I think this character of the gnome, like, he's whining and dining and biding his time. Look at the sky, look at the river, isn't it good? This is, like I was saying before, this sounds like someone who's been cooped up indoors.
Yeah.
And he's just put this silly character to the fact that he's like, he feels great about leaving his
being
space.
Outside.
Probably, maybe even leaving the studio at the end of the day, and he's like, he's feeling the air on his face. And he's like, oh, this is so much better. Do I really want to be in there doing this music stuff?
I didn't hear anything about him particularly loving the studio. And I think obviously more of the capital S stories come from later when he actively does not want to be in the studio and is just being obstinate, as they would have said. But like, I can't imagine that he was a guy who loved multiple takes. And actually, I think this is not a clean album. And we'll come on to it with Astronomy Domine. And obviously there's some riffs on this album, but I couldn't really, I mean, I can hum them, but like, I don't think of them as like, oh yeah, there's that riff and there's that riff. It's like, here's another musical line that's coming up, and then just kidding, we're going to have some harpsichord here, and then we're going to have some organ here. And I never get the feel like, okay, we're going to spotlight this riff, and then we're going to spotlight this vocal phrase. It's just another thing and another thing and another thing, layered on other things and other things and other things. And I feel like it's a very cluttery album, which I like. I just think that it's full.
Do you know what I think? Say if we was to split the album in half, so you got Light Side, which are the songs they've written, and then Dark Side being the more jammy ones.
Yeah.
You hear something like Interstellar Overdrive. I don't think, oh, there's a riff in there, there's a this, that in there. I think it sounds like movie score.
Yeah.
So like Interstellar Overdrive kept coming into my head, like if I was a director for a movie, and like I'd make it my mission to like use bits from this song to make a spy movie. It's got that surf rock thing going on there, like the tension moves about all over the place, but it's just jamming.
Starting with Astronomy Domine, I think we get into that. It was very obvious that they were meant to have like a light show, as Rufus said. There's meant to be a light show behind them. And I think Astronomy Domine is great for me. I think it's more tuneful than Interstellar Overdrive. but it's obviously in the same space rock vein. And it's funny, I feel like they only did this and then Interstellar Overdrive, and for the rest of time they got labeled space rock.
There's something quite jarring about having Astronomy Dominate was the first song on it, and starting off with that, it's quite a fun track, but then moving into stuff like The Gnome,
yeah,
it's just like it's very difficult to string those songs together.
And I guess this is what Ed was bringing up about The Light in the Dark, as in I think you have the kind of more nursery rhyme, and I'll take your point about maybe it's got more of a literary edge, but it feels really sing-songy and nursery rhymey, and then the obvious freak-out jams. And I think, again, agreeing with my point, is Sgt. Pepper's was obviously massively eclectic, and they did like 12 styles in 13 songs. I think this is equally as eclectic, but I'll say there's not a style. And I think that's actually the interesting thing to me, is it's the same level of eclecticism, but I guess there's a little bit of like surf rock here, but there's not really, like, I don't hear folk really, I don't hear the blues really. It's just like psychedelic onslaught all the time, even though every song does have a flavor, like the Scarecrow's all built on wood blocks, and this one's all built on like surf guitar, and then there's really interesting keyboard work, which actually I'll come to now. I think one of the most interesting developments Pink Floyd undergoes is right now it's Rick in one ear and Sid in the other ear. So keyboard doing a ton of stuff and guitar in the other ear doing a ton of stuff. They'll continue that all the way up through probably Sauce Full of Secrets, kind of almost into metal. But then by Dark Side of the Moon, the keyboards become a pad for just guitar solos. And I was like, it's an interesting transition with Pink Floyd, but I'd say that's also an interesting transition with music in general, or rock music in general. Keyboards and guitars were on equal footing, and then it became keyboards are the pad on which a guitar can just rock over.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? It's like, when do these things happen just because they happened? And when was it like actually chosen that we're going to do it that way because I heard it on this album? When do things become like the trope? And on this album, I feel like the keys, they tend to come in those clean bits of the record, don't they? When you really hear them, and it's a separate thing. They're not working against the guitar or with the guitar. It's instead of, and I think they work really well with. Like every time I notice the organ, it's when I really hear like really good bass lines when I didn't notice them before.
We'll come to that as well right now, and I think that's another really obvious sonic element of this. So now, obviously, you'd have drums and bass right down the middle, and then you'd have guitar and keyboards in one ear, the other ear, or maybe also kind of down the middle if it was like a riff or something. I feel like Norman Smith, God bless him, threw caution to the wind, and the guitar's in one ear sometimes, the bass is in another ear, the drums are in the, like, far back in the mix, and then for the next song, the drums will be up at the front and the bass is in the back. And I honestly felt like every day he just mixed each song a little bit differently. And I think that was part of the eclecticism of this album. I never sat down and been like, okay, they just ever played these 11 songs or 13 songs, whatever it is. They just never sat down, played them in one room, and he just kind of put a hot mic on it. It was always like every day we're just going to record some element and chuck it in one ear at some level, and we'll just see what comes out.
Yeah, I think that's something that I didn't enjoy about the album, was the use of stereo. There's an innocence to it. It's like, it sounds like someone who's just not really thought about it that much, but he probably was experimenting and playing. Like, I feel like the mix in regard to the volume of each instrument, like, I really enjoy that. I think, the way the organ and the bass work beautifully together. Like, yep. I think he records, the fuzz element of the guitar nicely. I think that is actually a tricky thing to do, whether you do it on purpose or not. Like, I think he's got like some really good guitar tones on there. But yeah, the stereos.
Hard panning.
I just don't like hard panning. I think it throws me too much when it's flopping about the place like that.
And I will say I think that probably contributes to why I think this album sounds cheap. And I don't think that's necessarily true if we talk about like actual pounds and pence. I don't know how much this cost to make relative to, say, Sgt. Pepper's, but it sounds so much more amateurish in that sense.
You know, like they did have some expensive bits of gear.
I mean, they're in Abbey Road for this album, so they are next to the Beatles.
It's expensive stuff that they're using, like that. You know, they didn't have that space on the cheap, so their label must have given them some money to play with here. You know, I think, you know, you've got producers just worked with the Beatles. He couldn't have been cheap.
So I think quite famously with Norman, he was less of a producer who just asked for takes and then told them all to go away after that was done, you know, but rather they could play more of a part with the actual production side of things. So he would invite them into the booth, and I do wonder
how much this is their fault too.
I see.
Yeah, how much did they do and how much did Norman do?
Right.
You know, they're really trying to push the boundaries at the time. So were they also being like, yeah, let's stick the drums all in the left ear, that sounds great? And, you know, especially with Norman being quite, I guess, new to the process. I mean, obviously he did stuff with the Beatles with engineering for them, but to produce a whole album is different. And I think, you know, especially when you're producing a bunch of 20-year-old kids, there's a bit of people management in there as well, right?
Yeah.
So
Shepherding.
I wonder how much that had to play.
Yeah.
So, after Astronomy Domine, we come to the lighter side of this album, Lucifer Sam. And I guess it's funny because these are still pretty creepy songs.
Yeah, I don't think this one fits into the light category.
No. But I think, you know, this is the other part of the album where it's just filled with these, like, little story songs, basically. And I don't really know what this song's about. I don't know if you have much to say about this song, or indeed the gnome or the scarecrow.
I think for this one, it's just, you know, it just sounds like paranoia to me. It sounds like I'm being pursued.
Yeah.
It is great chase music.
Yeah.
There's a thing he does where for slide sounds he uses like a Zippo lighter.
Okay.
And I think it seems like a cheap thing to use, like if you haven't got a slide. But if you think about it, like the Zippo, it has like the slide bit, but it's also got like a little latch on there, you know, like where the lid flips over and it's scratchy. And you can hear like this sort of scratch sound. I think that, along with the sound of the delay, like I actually really dig that. It's like it's just a cool noise. So it's like I imagine this to be like a great track to hear them play live, and I can imagine there being like a bit of, you know, guitar virtuosity that goes on here that just cannot be captured in the studio setting.
Do you reckon he whacked out the Zippo lighter for the live performances?
Oh yeah. So he did that quite a bit. But yeah, so it's, but you know what I mean. It's just playing a bit of slide. But I just think like the fact that he uses that instead of an actual slide, you've got this weird scrape sound that you hear in this track, and I think that's what it is.
It's almost a bit punk, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And I think like these young guys, aren't they? With lots of energy. Like it is punk. Doesn't sound punk, but.
But something that's completely not punk is Matilda Mother. The next song, and again, it just keeps up with the theme of like these little like stories about people or things or whatever. And the thing that just absolutely jumps out at me is, man, Rick Wright and Syd Barrett really had a really good vocal, I don't know, duo. Yeah. Like their voices are so similar.
There's like a sub-harmony that it starts off with in this. It's really low. Like I can't hit that note. And it blends really well with the main vocal, I think. But as the song goes on, it becomes more of a typical vocal harmony you'd imagine in this sort of song.
But is the magic of their vocals that their voices are really similar? Because I think now of Peter Gabriel and Phil Collins, that they're similar but not the same. Like, is that the magic of singing together well?
I think usually when you are looking for layered vocals, it's better to have different tonalities, right? Like different voices, because it brings a width and sort of richness to the vocal that you lose if it's just the same person or the same sounding person.
Yeah.
I think perhaps the only difference there is when you're then doing harmonies. If you're doing harmonies, then perhaps you want a voice that's closer to that of the leading vocal.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it?
Yeah, because I really like Rick's voice a lot, and we don't really get to hear that much of it throughout Pink Floyd's career. But obviously he and Dave had a really, really good thing going on. But he and Sid had a very good thing going on. It must just be, for me at least, that Rick sounds just enough different from Sid that he brings, as you say, that width or that breadth or whatever it is, whilst not being jarringly different.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? It's like, from a producer's perspective, what Rufus just said is obvious. It's like, yeah, you've got these different textures, gives you all that width and space and makes the record interesting. But you've also got like these kind of world music scales being used here. There's like this kind of North African sort of vibe that I can hear.
Yep.
And it's quite complex for young guys to be, putting these sort of textures into the music.
I don't know what that was, but Rick keeps it going for the next few albums is kind of a very, I'll call it arabesque.
What, the sort of harmonic minor and stuff like that? Or
yeah.
Is it...
And I think, obviously it's the thing that influenced surf rock, but it's got that minor key with the drone going up and down. He's on the Farfisa organ. Obviously, Barrett will play around with those scales on his guitar, and Gilmour will continue that tradition through their psychedelic years, kind of. So the next track bucks the trend in so much it's not about anything. It's probably actually my favorite song on this album, and this is Flaming. And it's not really in that same nursery rhyme vein. It's kind of actually reminiscent to me of stuff on Metal. And I think toward David Gilmour to have done this later in 1971, it would be a really chill song. But the song as it is now is just filled to the brim with bits, just stuff over it. But I just love this song. And I don't even feel like there's parts. I feel like he's just saying a thing, and that's in one tempo and time signature. And then he does another line, and that feels to be almost in a different tempo and time signature. And I feel like it does work. And I don't know what it is about maybe the earnestness that he brings to this. We talked about earnestness in the Days of the Future Past last week. But again, these songs, like, they're so about simple things. Or I don't know how simple they are. They're about on-the-surface childish things. But he stares right down the camera.
I think you sum him up with this. Like he's got a way of delivering like lines that are just completely unlandable by normal humans.
Yeah.
Like words like buttercups, like traveling by telephone. Sleeping on a dandelion. Like lying on what's it? Lying on an eiderdown. Yippee! You can't see me, but I can see you. It's like talking about eiderdowns and actually using the word yippee. I don't know people who can sing that stuff, but he just does it. It's like he doesn't think about it. This is what the song's about. I'm not going to spell out to you what the meaning of this song is, but here are the words I'm using, and take it or leave it. I think people in general, like, they're so concerned with how people see them that they think too much about what they're writing, maybe, and you just wouldn't be able to say that today,
And I guess this is listening to Yes way too much. But Flaming always feels like the most serious song on this album to me. And I couldn't tell you why, because it's very obviously probably talking about being a tiny little elf living in a forest, like floating on an eiderdown.
Literally sitting on a unicorn.
Literally. Yeah, just checking out the buttercups, like that type of thing. And I was like, now that you mention it, it's like, oh yeah, it's also got the fairy tale element. But for some reason, and again, this is completely just Yes having completely melted my mind, I was like, oh, it feels deep. And I've never looked into what the song's about at all, but it feels deep.
I think it's a simple concept again. I think it's a guy he just wants to be outdoors. It's someone who feels cooped up, and he just loves being outside. He loves nature, and that's always the things that he talks about with positivity.
So he is from Cambridge. So for our American listeners or our global listeners, what do you think being from Cambridge brought to this? In terms of, is it a particularly rural part of England?
It's no concrete jungle. As a kid who grew up in the country, I didn't think of fairies and toadstools and stuff. I don't know. I always, rather than it being the Cambridge influence, although obviously he's aware of the English countryside, I always saw it as a sort of Lewis Carroll-esque adventure into obscurity and psychedelia.
Yeah, but like, actually, that's an interesting author to bring up. That's probably the sort of thing they would have been reading. You know, like the name of the album comes from something that was mentioned in The Wind of the Willows, which was his favourite book. You know, Roger Waters describes Syd Barrett as the Piper in another song. He is the Piper of Pan to his bandmates. You know, he's this whimsical, folky guy. But yeah, that was his favourite book, was Wind in the Willows, like a kid's story that's little animals that have got their own personalities. And
I was going to say, I actually think him being a Piper a la Pan ties in with this, whereas I feel like that you never quite feel relaxed in this album. It's got the true wildness of nature.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Whereas you feel like you truly are kind of in the woods of psychedelia.
I was just thinking about it. Maybe that does make sense with the, you know, how Ed was talking about the light and dark shades of the album. Because when you think about, you know, Wind in the Willows or Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, they are, on the surface, quite whimsical, quite playful children's stories, but they have such dark undertones as well.
They're pretty creepy.
And perhaps this album somehow mirrors that?
Yes.
Yeah, it makes me want to look at my fairy tales a little bit differently.
Well, I mean, I think this is even true for fairy tales. Like, they're famously also creepy. Like,
yeah.
I was going to say, like, your OG fairy tales are all about elves abducting children.
Teaching kids a lesson, right?
Teaching them a lesson. And I think that's kind of I think there's an element of, like, you're on the edge of the woods and there's a little gnome and you don't know his intentions. Like, I think there's that element to this.
The lesson of this album is don't do LSD, kids.
No drugs, and stay in school, I guess. So I guess after the Majesty of Flaming, there's a brief little freak out here with Pow R Talk H. And this is a completely instrumental song that's vocal scat rap giving way into a long, basically keyboard solo. And honestly, I love this song. It's so unusual, and then it's just so nice to hear Rick Wright just jam out. Like, I really love his piano style. And I look back and I'm sad that he never did, like, a piano trio jazz album. I actually think he has a really pleasing piano style, and we'll hear less of that as Pink Floyd goes on, which is a tragedy. But I think this brings up probably the most obvious thing to me that Pink Floyd retained in their very DNA, and that's wild experimentation. And I think every album from here on out, they will experiment wildly. And you think even Dark Side of the Moon, you know, their most commercial pop hit, they have voices from interviews that they interspersed in the album. They'll have, you know, all sorts of, like, weird soundscapes in all of their commercially successful albums. And I actually think that was one of the things that brought Pink Floyd from being, quote-unquote, just a classic rock band, and simultaneously maintained their, important for this podcast, their prog pedigree. But I think this wild experimentation, the others would carry on.
It's elastic, isn't it, this track? It's elastic in its mood. It starts off with this kind of syncopated vocal rhythmy loop thing. When that kicked in, I thought, this has caught me straight away. And then, again, more great use of the time-based effect. I think the that very slight delay that causes flanging is used on the drum there, but again, it's not dramatic. I think this is the one where it's got, like, the better guitar tone for me. It's like that nice crunchy sound that's, it's a fuzz pedal with the volume rolled off a little bit. That's classic rock, just dialed in real sweet. And then as soon as the organ kicks in, it just alters. It's this elastic mood band. It's really interesting. I do like it.
With that big sort of energetic crescendo, sort of like 2/3 of the way through as well. You know, like, it gets you so anxious, I guess, and then I don't know, like halfway through the third minute, it just kind of just pieces out into this nice little soundscape. It's very interesting.
It's got a beginning, a middle, and end in a little jam.
Well, and I was going to say, I think, again, that's something that maybe also Pink Floyd really maintained quite excellently relative to other bands, is I actually feel like they were such a vibes band. Frankly, it doesn't feel like they composed this song much. But that kind of the, like, we're going to start with some goofy mouth sounds and then build. And if that's just Rick just smashing on an organ or something, yeah, I can really feel that. Like, you feel Pink Floyd very intensely.
Yeah, I love all the vocal stuff on this album. This track was great, just seeing them play with the vocal stuff. And I think that's something you only do with people you're close with in a studio set. Otherwise, the singer does his singing thing, the guitarist does his... You know what I mean? Like, it gets quite separated, but when people are having fun together...
You could tell they were playing together.
Yeah.
So, we go from the insane experimentation of Pow R Talk H to Roger's first attempt at writing, Take Up Thy Stethoscope and Walk. And the most obvious thing about this is I don't think it's that great of a song, but it melts away into some of the most wild jamming on this album.
Yeah, the drums are great.
Yeah, I honestly, I think they really do a good job capturing, I think, for posterity, their live vibes.
Yeah, I think one of the notes I put on this one was organ, bass, and the surf tones. If that was a mainstream type written song, that would be a seller right there for like just sound. But it isn't. It's not a mainstream.
No. You
know, music seems to help the pain, seems to motivate the brain. You know, like that's not a mainstream song, is it? This is some dark stuff.
And we've got a while to go before Roger comes into his own. But I'm very glad to hear that he's starting the process.
He's giving it a shot.
And I think, genuinely, it's probably just like you need to get that confidence. And in a Pink Floyd career trajectory, I don't think they could have grown into the people they needed to be with Sid there, because obviously he was just so talented at this stage as a songwriter. I think, the next one, the next album, Roger's going to get left hanging and left holding the compositional hot potato, basically.
Yeah, he's got to get good, otherwise they fail.
Right. And, necessity is the mother of invention.
Yeah.
So the next one is the jam of jams. And interestingly, I think because it does all the things Astronomy Domine does, but worse, I don't really like this song as much. But this is one of their greatest fan favorites from this album, Interstellar Overdrive.
Yeah, I love it.
And I was going to say, watching this with the visuals would have probably been a treat.
Yeah, I think it's got that spy movie vibe that I like.
Yeah,
I was kind of listening to that echo rec sound, which is the delay unit I was talking about before. I love the use of it on this, and it made me think like I want this in my guitar rig.
Actually, it's funny you mention this. I actually do think a lot of this soundscape came back with, I'm going to completely butcher the name, but Karaburangarin. Nailed it. Kurabing.
Huh?
Kurabang. KHR. That jammy guitar band.
Oh, right, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not going to try and say it.
You dickheads.
Karangabin.
There we go. No, this kind of, and there was a band that I really enjoyed, Tennis. I think this super, super, super 60 sound, like this very distilled 60 sound, that actually the Beatles were too polished to have. I think this really 60 sound, I think you hear again now in the neo-psychedelic bands like Rufus.
Karangabin.
So we've come back out of space, and we come very much onto the ground, and it's finally time to meet the little guy we've been talking about for an hour now. Grimble Grumble, the gnome. So let's actually talk about this track finally. This is, again, one of my favorite songs on this album, much as I probably dunked on it previously for being about the gnome. I just love it. Like, I think it's so well arranged, and I feel like they do a good job of him, like, skipping through the forest, and then he comes, I don't know, to a clearing, and he looks at the sky, he looks at the river, isn't it good? And you feel like you're being washed in the river. I don't know if this was them or if this was Norman, but man, they captured the vibe of being a gnome.
I think the band, they do listen to the singer. And they play off his vibes.
Yes.
Definitely. I don't think the gnome's supposed to be like a literal gnome. I think he is just generally giving off his love of nature and being outside.
I find this one of the more pleasant listens on the, like, just generally. I know the content is quite sort of playful and whimsical, but actually just to listen to is really pleasant. And it's such a far cry from the sort of harsh overtones of like droning guitars that you get in Interstellar Overdrive.
Yeah.
Just suddenly you're in a little forest. Yeah.
Man, it's a very clean song.
Yeah.
And actually, this is probably one of the most decluttered songs on the album, which is probably why I've always been drawn to it. And it's also just, it's a 2-minute interlude. Like, there's nothing more to it. It's just he talks about a gnome walking around. And to Ed's point, maybe it is a cry to go back to nature, to leave the studio or whatever. And I would totally take that point. But whatever it is, it puts you in the headspace of being a gnome. So,
yeah.
Good on you, Sid.
Do we know, like, I don't know where Sid was born. Like, was he...
He's born in Cambridge.
He's born in Cambridge, okay.
Like the city of.
Because it's quite clear that he's got this love of nature, and I just wonder where it blossomed from.
I think having been to Cambridge, you don't need to walk that far. And I imagine this was even more true in 1967. You don't need to walk that far until you're in a field.
Mm.
Yeah.
This is also like from the university itself. Like you go out, there's a giant field in the town, but there's the river that runs through Cambridge, the Cam.
Mm.
And even now it's a pretty, even in, when was I last there, 2019, it's a pretty whimsical place with people punting up and down the river with those little boats. And you could imagine lazing away.
Yeah, I went to Oxford when everyone was punting down the river and it was filthy. I just thought, this is not
a safe space for a gnome.
Yeah, no gnome should be here.
No gnomes. Well, they got the little fishnet and fishing them out of the river. A little two-headed gnomes. But no, Cambridge, even now in 2000, whatever it is still a pretty whimsical town. And as I say, if you are on the edge of Cambridge, you can go out to kind of river and or field pretty quickly. And there's still ancient oaks. Even within the town, it's very Harry Pottery. And you can imagine the Hilda folk living within all the nooks and crannies of this, like, what feels like genuinely a pretty ancient place.
That makes sense.
That's the thing. I think if you're, a musician or a painter and you spend all your time creating stuff indoors, you just want to get outside, full stop. And
as you brought up, I feel like that's probably this, I don't know how consciously it is, but he's looking out the studio window thinking like, man, I want to be back in the field.
Yeah.
So speaking of fields, well, actually, so we take a quick little detour to chapter 24.
That would have been a fantastic segue.
Speaking of reading, like they probably do in Cambridge, thank you for that transition. Chapter 24. Frankly, this is the only song on this album that I really skip. It's not whimsical and it's not dark and it's not intense. It's the worst part of this album where it's just annoying sound effects and disjointed lyrics. But it's not melodic. And actually, I think I will then use this part to bring up how unbelievably good Sid Barrett was at melodies. I'll take your point, Rufus, that this is filled to the brim, clogged with sound effects and nonsense. But can you imagine a world in which someone sang these songs with just an acoustic guitar and they are pleasant, sing-songy songs?
Perhaps you don't have to remove all of it, but I think if you tone it down like 30%, then suddenly you've got Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Yeah, they just needed someone just to be like, this is great, but you don't need that, and let's keep this. And then it would have been a much better song.
Like, lyrically, this is the one that I think he's done the best job on. So it would be the one to do the best production on.
For sure.
It made me think, what is this book that he's
the I Ching
loosely writing the lyrics based on? This isn't like he's just reading words from that book. He's done his own interpretation of it. He's made rhyme of the words he's read in the book. And to do that is actually a hell of a feat, I think. You're reinterpreting a narrative, but you're doing it in a way that is your own work and is poetic, and really interesting. I was there listening to these lines thinking, I don't really understand what that means, but I want to know. Like, I want to read this book. I think generally he's a guy who's interested in the subject matter of his lyrics first and foremost, and I think the reason why he can land a clumsy lyric, like, no, I don't mean like it's a badly written lyric. I mean like he can land a lyric that's got too many syllables in it in the wrong place, because he does it all the time. Because he doesn't write melody first. He has his poems and he puts them to music.
There are these vocal runs that he does. It's a little bit at the start and then quite a lot in the second half that I think, like, they're really good and they're really nice to listen to. And I think if they structured the song more around those and less around the stuff that kind of lies smack bang in the middle, then they could have made something better, basically. Because it's got that airy, floaty vibe in places that isn't really touched on in the rest of the album that much, I don't think. Again, it's a case of having a new feeling to one of the songs in the album, which is interesting, but also I think they just needed to add just a little bit more
focus.
It sounds weird. Remove 30%, but double down on other bits.
Yeah. So, chapter 24, a very, very interesting effort lyrically. Then we come to The Scarecrow, which I think is one of the most interesting songs sonically. And I think the absolute bravery of basically making a woodblock song in 1967 strikes to the creativity of these four lads.
The woodblock thing, it almost sounds like a loop. Like, can you get people doing looping? They put something down, it just flips over, and they just add another layer, and then they add another layer. I don't know if they recorded it that way, but I don't know. I kind of heard that.
Very interesting if they did. I can't imagine that they would have. Again, I think this whole thing was done on 4-track, so that's something else. And again, like, it's, I don't want to say cheap, but it feels like a really amateur, kids having fun in the studio type of effort. This continues in The Scarecrow. I think he's written a very, very kids in the field type of song here again.
Yeah, it's positive imagery, isn't it?
Yeah. And again, I guess this is part of your theme about he just wants to be outside playing in a field.
Do you know what? This one, I didn't really tune into the lyrics much. I did find myself enjoying the harmonies between the two vocalists. But I was just listening to the music and listening to the sounds of the voices together. I didn't really read into the lyrics too much, to be honest.
And I don't love this song. I think, again, it goes to the really creepy nursery rhyme element. And I mean, God, scarecrows are creepy. But the song does grab me with its innovative use of wood blocks. I mean, it's oddly ominous for being a predominantly wood block jam. And again, I think it's the really unusual melodies that he kind of uses.
Wood blocks are so often used as a sound for bones and skeletons, so I wouldn't be surprised in your subconscious you're linking it to that.
I was going to say, yeah, how many wood chop? How many woodblock jams have you been listening to?
I mean, I've got my woodblock compilation album, Block Rock 68. So, yeah, Scarecrow, kind of creepy. I need more woodblocks in my life. And then we come to Bike. And I think this is the only part of the album where, like, this had to be at the end. Because it has I'll say, Her Majesty on Abbey Road. Just this, like, really weird little ending fragment. Because the actual part of Bike is only a minute and a half. And then there's a soundscape freakout. But in many ways, it encapsulates the lyrical themes on the album. In so much as there's a bike, there's a mouse.
What's the name of the mouse again?
Gerald.
I like the line, "You're the kind of girl that really fits into my world." I think it's not too often you hear like typical kind of love song themes with Pink Floyd, but yeah, like I think that's like a really nice line. I think, typical love song line, but I like that sentiment that fits in with my world. Like, it's not like you're glorifying someone, you're not pedestaling someone, you're saying this person's right for me. And I think that's just like a really nice line, nice way of saying that.
And I think it's the only time he got personal, to my knowledge. Like, it's actually the first time and the only time, really, that he sings to someone who's on Earth. Because I actually can't think of any other times where he really does this. except for the very last time, which we'll talk about, but go on.
But again, despite that, it's another example where these sort of sentiments, like, they only kind of appeal to this sort of tweed kind of Englishy vibe thing, and then you take that to a different audience, and is it ever going to land? Is this ever going to be a long-term band with that sort of narrative?
As in the narrative being
too much narrative, you know what I mean? It's like, there's not enough of that sort of simple.
Yeah, no, and I was going to say, and I think that's something that this era of Pink Floyd absolutely lacks, is that they never sang a song to someone. They're singing about all this other stuff. And it feels maybe subconsciously like they're avoiding the real conversation, if that's what you want to call it. As in, I could imagine for a record-buying public, like Somebody to Love, also from 1967. Think about that American, right to the heart of the matter, straight to your face, I'm just going to sing you this song. I think this, we're out in the woods, we're with a scarecrow, we're with a gnome. Like, I think you feel like we're avoiding the real conversation. Now, I like it because this is delightful, fantastical escapism in its way, but I could see how this would miss the mark. But it's a very pleasing song, and it's very fun. And again, I think this ends the album on a great, lighthearted way that, again, just makes me delighted to have been along for the journey. So we take a darker edge now, unfortunately. They finish this album, and it becomes a hit, and they tour, and Syd Barrett is not doing so well. But they come back together, and they go into the studio again with Norman Smith to work on their second album, Saucerful of Secrets. And during this album, Syd will only complete one song, and that's the final song, Jug Band Blues. Syd has this one last song in Pink Floyd's discography, and it's unsettling because it's the only time, and it feels like there was this one break in the clouds, and you don't know if he was singing about himself or to the others, or if he's just saying words like, we'll never know. And it feels like it was perfectly written to be endlessly parsed. But my God, it's a good song, and it gives me absolute chills.
Yeah, I think he's definitely, this is the first time he's addressing what's going on, basically. And I think that, what a poignant end,
Because he will actually record 2 other albums after this, solo albums. And they're just, again, about little stories. It feels really interesting, and it's almost like this yell from the void. I can't think of another song that's like this, where someone came back from somewhere to, relay this news about, this is the state I'm in. And I'm sure, music is a pretty broad world. I'm sure someone must have done something like this, but I can't think of what it is, and certainly not many that have affected me like this. But Syd came back just this one last time on this album just to say, hey, I'm not doing so hot, or have you forgotten about me? How dare you? I don't know exactly what the point of this is, but it feels like he's at least addressing around the subject. But then the flip side is, by all accounts, I'm not sure how well he was doing. It doesn't sound like he was particularly responsive or anything. There is footage of them playing this on Top of the Pops. So for other listeners, Top of the Pops was a television program in which basically British bands would mime their pop hits. And unfortunately, this was a hit, and Syd just sits there staring. It's brutal. And he's just sitting there he's completely out of it. So I don't know. I don't know how, what he was like in the studio with this. But man, it's a haunting song.
That's really sad, isn't it?
Well,
yeah.
There's this one story with Waters about Syd's not his final time he was in the studio, but he comes in and he says to Waters, I've made this new song, and Waters is like, finally, great, some new content, right, let's go, teach me it. And he sits down with his guitar, and Syd's teaching him the song, and he plays the song, and he's like, have you got it yet? And he's like, oh no, it's too hard, do it, play it again. And it keeps going over and over and over again, and at the end of the song, Syd keeps going, have you got it yet? But after each time he repeats the song, he changes it. Finally, Waters just goes, yeah, okay, I get it. I think I got it. And it just gets up and leaves. Just Syd playing one final horrible trick.
No, and I was going to say, I honestly don't know what the state of Sid would have been in the studio. Like, I imagine he could have been quite obstinate as they would have perceived it, like playing these little gags for his own amusement. And I guess it must have just been like outrageously frustrating for everyone, as we're trying to be a popular band and we're trying to record this GD album. That must have absolutely driven everyone like over the edge there. So yeah, and that was it for Sid with Pink Floyd.
Who can possibly know what was going on in someone's mind? It must have been a scary thing to go through. And like, what a disappointment for those around him, who wanted, this was the guy that they were like, he was their front man, it must have been such a disappointing experience to have to live with that, and to have to pick up the mantle must have been really scary. But they did, and they kept going and they became super successful. So like, it's an amazing story.
It's an amazing story. And I think it's got the love and loss. And then I will say, to end this part of it on a really high note, I think he left a very positive and fun album.
Yeah. Like
just overflowing with creativity and wackiness. And I feel joy listening to it. Like it's not that clouded for me.
It's certainly the most upbeat Pink Floyd album ever. which is quite funny considering it,
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right.
It contains the best gnome song I've ever heard.
So there you have it. That was Piper at the Gates of Dawn. I have been your host, Ian Prize, and this has been a sort of young person's guide to prog rock. Do find us over at ProgFrogPod at Instagram. And if you have any longer thoughts, opinions, or queries, we are at helloprogfrog at gmail.com. I want to thank my guests, Rufus and Ed.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me on.
This album set Pink Floyd up on their career. Piper at the Gates of Dawn was a success, but unfortunately this was all not to last. As we've talked about, Sid's mental health declined rapidly after this album, and he left Pink Floyd and music in general shortly after. So Piper would stand as an album basically from a different band, but Pink Floyd would persevere, recruiting David Gilmour and embarking on a journey of psychedelic noodling and extended jamming. However, we will return to them later when they come out of the psychedelic wilderness and start preparing for their string of classic albums with 1971's Metal. But next week, perhaps deciding psychedelic music was much too fun, a young guitarist crammed as much jazz, moog, and mellotron as he could into 45 minutes, and thus progressive rock was born. Join us next time for King Crimson's In the Court of the Crimson King. Basically creating a God damn.
You can do this, man. You can do it.
All right, here we go.
I believe in you.
All right, it's going. Here we go.